remembering Jimmy, yeah. That phrase seems to imply a trove of anecdotes and stories and so on. So I might begin by telling you the first thing that I wrote down that James said in the class that I was in at the University of Wisconsin 48 years ago. 48 years, yeah. Much older than he was then. Apropos the strangeness of a workshop in poetry, he said, well, you know, what you do with your loneliness is your own business. And I might go on then, eventually, to end with an anecdote rooted in a poem called Pledge, in his last book, Scattering Souls, about the peculiar fate of a Japanese bronze cricket that he gave to me and my former wife after we got married. But I would have to preface these remarks with a demur. For one thing, I always knew him as James, not as Jimmy. And for the other more important one, well, I knew him for all those years that I did. That was 27, 28 years that I knew him. And I do have a few stories, and have been able to tell a couple of them elsewhere. When I sat down to muse over today, I found myself recurring to thoughts less biographic than aesthetic. And I think the reason is that in James's case, as so many people have already made so abundantly clear, the poet and the work are one thing. You just cannot get them apart. The two things, the two forces coalesce. And this is kind of strange because he never, you know, in social gatherings, he never ever had a word to say about poetry. I never heard James talk shop in all the conversations that I eavesdropped on all those years. He never got technical in public. He would talk to people, of course, privately, whom he knew well. He never talked shop at social gatherings. But the work is always there in the forefront of his mind, as everybody's been saying. In his short verse play, The Image Maker, the titular character, who is a proxy for the poet, the image maker, responds to the voice of his reproachful mother, who laments the absence of grandchildren with the simple plea for understanding. My work, Mama, that's my whole life. And he's speaking directly there, the Santana for James Merrill. In another context, Lanny quoted the phrase the other day, prompted by an interviewer. He put it quite plainly. He said, poetry made me what I am. I take that last phrase, to which I'd like to interrogate a little bit, to be more of a claim of avowal rather than vocation. Poetry made me what I am. In a lighter mood, I think he was thinking along the same lines when we first spoke, he and I, after a class that I took with him in Wisconsin. The term was over, and my wife and I had finally worked up to Tamara Hick to ask him to dinner just before he left town. And we were walking down the hall in the student union. I'd never taken a workshop before, and I would never take a workshop again. It wasn't James' fault. What he taught certainly wasn't a workshop. He didn't want us to embarrass ourselves in front of others. And so we almost never talked about things in class. I think there was one translation of a song by Heine that we all got to look at other people's translations of, but we didn't see other people's works. We had to go talk to James by ourselves if we wanted edification along those lines. And so here we are at the end of the quarter, and I didn't know what still don't know what creative writing is, and I asked him, you know, how do you go about grading a course like this? And he thought for a second. He said, well, he said it wasn't hard. He said, I gave an A to those people who love poetry, and I gave a B to those people who love themselves. I think there was a person. I think he said then, I don't think I'm just filling in, that he gave a C to those people who didn't love anybody. If not, that was implicit, I think, in what you had to say. And I didn't know quite what he meant. I suppose that he meant to love poetry, you had to go off and memorize a lot of Shakespeare eagerly, or maybe imitate George Herbert and Valley Lee. But much later, when I began to read his poems more closely and talk to him about his work, it dawned on me that he meant something else. The same thing maybe that his familiar spirit Ephraim had in mind in that wonderful sequence names for him when he elaborated to the Ouija boarders, James and David, on the concept of devotion. And Ephraim says, and now about devotion. It is, I am forced to believe, the main impetus. Devotion to each other, to work, to reproduction, to an ideal. It is both the mold and the clay. So we arrive at God, or devotion to all or many's idea of the continuum. And then Ephraim gets very excited, and it's hard to follow him beyond that moment of kind of touching on the mystical state of devotion or love. This is a concept that James would have been familiar with from Wallace Stevens, who has come up frequently, and I'm glad to see it these last few days. So it's been a long time coming, the connection between James Merrill and Wallace Stevens, which is very deep. He had a lot of influence on the early Merrill, and notes toward supreme fiction, especially. That long poem was a constellation that James navigated by. And James did have Shakespeare and Baudelaire and many other people by heart, of course. He knew more lines by heart than anybody I've ever known. And I'll never forget the intensity with which he would recite, on occasion or two, the end, very last section of Notes Towards Supreme Fiction. Stevens begins that sequence, you'll recall, with a prefatory verse, which is apparently not addressed to the dedicatee of the poem in the church, but to something else. And for what, Stevens asks, except for you, do I feel love? Do I press the extremest book of the wisest man close to me, hidden in my day and night? Later in this poem, in his little poem, conjuring the situation in which he and his lover meet, Stevens tells us that in the uncertain light of a single living truth, equal in living changingness to the light in which I meet you, his lover, in which we sit at rest for a moment in the central of our being, the vivid transparency bring his peace. Excuse me, let me do my Marco Rubio. Vivid transparency that brings peace. Now, it's surely that passage, among others, that James had in mind when he decided to call his epic The Changing Light of Sandover. And Notes Toward Supreme Fiction, I think, could be a good candidate. His own extremist book, The Wisest Man. In any case, when I'm sorry, when he concluded, he did one of the PBS TV shows, was on Wallace Stevens, and James kind of managed that program. And he reverted to the light, to the vivid transparency of his predecessor in a poem called Final Soliloquy of the Interior Paramour, which I had on the screen, and see I have my own technological difficulties. And now I need the person whose phone it is to bring it up again. Thank you very much. See how easy Judy is out there. So this is Stevens' poem, Final Soliloquy of the Interior Paramour. I'm not going to read it all. I wish I could. James recited it at the end of that Voices of Vision series. Light, the first light of evening, as in a room in which we rest, and for small reason think the world imagined is the ultimate good. This is, therefore, the intensest rendezvous. It is in that thought that we collect ourselves out of all the indifferences into one thing. Within a single thing, single shawl wrapped tightly round us, since we are poor. A hope, a warmth, a light, a power, the miraculous influence. I will quote a few phrases from the poem as I go on here, but what I'm thinking is that to love poetry in the sense that James meant it, that love permits us, as Stevens says later on, to forget each other and ourselves. The poem continues here. Now we forget each other and ourselves. We find the obscurity of an order, a whole, a knowledge, that which arranged the rendezvous. And I think that it is this direct engagement with poetry that permits this feeling of the obscurity of an order, a whole, a knowledge, that which arranged the rendezvous within its vital boundary in the mind that James had in mind when he's talking about the love of poetry. And this is a hard thing for me to get hold of, and I'm not sure that I've got hold of it at all. And by it now, by loving poetry, I mean the direct engagement with it in the process of composition. It's that lets us understand somehow, Stevens says, that God and the imagination are one. That's Stevens' phrase, of course, which James used many times in the course of his poems and interviews and so on. James has a secular version of it, I think, in mind. When he once quoted Valet to me, he said, here's Valet. The grand achievement of poets is the ability to grasp forcefully in their words what they can only feebly entertain in their spirit. And it's kind of a thorny saying. Grasp in your words what you can only feebly entertain in your spirit. Worth thinking about, I think. But I think that's the way that he was getting at this idea. But that's quite a jump. So let me try to get at the notion another way, maybe straighter way. In the course of editing James's poems, I've been struck by the frequency of his conviction that he's often unable to feel as keenly or as deeply as people are supposed to feel. He sometimes takes this ability to empathize or sympathize, to be moved emotionally, as the distinguishing feature of humanity. What it means to be human is to feel. And when he doesn't feel sufficiently, he seems to himself to be less than human, and on occasion, less than real. His means of making himself human, so to speak, indeed creating himself, is by writing. And by writing now, I mean the entire complex of composition, from inspiration through endless revision in his case. The image maker, in his little play, in the course of making his images, his poems, inhabits, however temporarily, that state of mind in which he perceives that God and the imagination are one. I don't think that state can be crisply delineated. I think that we have to settle for something like Stevens' thought in which we collect ourselves out of all the indifferences into one thing, which he goes ahead and glosses, I've told you, as a light, a power, a miraculous influence, and the intensest rendezvous. So anyway, so when I remember James, I do, there are lots of anecdotes that I love, but what kept coming to mind as I was getting ready for today is the man who kept collecting himself out of all the indifferences, the relationships, the familial, social, intimate relationships, and all they entailed, and all the travels, all the languages, all of which he cared deeply about, of course, but in a way they are, I think, indifferences when compared to the writing of the poem. And that is the one thing, I think, that he focused on all his life. just another way. Poem after poem, he traces out, no, the poems constitute the development of a state of being from coldness or isolation, alienation, or loneliness. What you do with your loneliness is your own business. To a union, or a reunion, or a communion. And what he did with his loneliness, I think, was to contrive verbal objects that made him feel the most that he ever did otherwise, to be completely human, to feel and to think as fully as possible all at once, to come to an understanding, transient though it might be, of an order, a whole. For him, I think it's for Yeats, not being in love and therefore losing, but writing about being in love and of course losing was peak, the empowering experience for him. His first major long poem, 2002nd Night, begins with a speaker who is bored, alone, halfway around the world from his home, ill, his face is half paralyzed, and the following sections work out through the narration the experience of the speaker's rejuvenation. Nightgown, the poem that precedes it in Nights and Days, starts with a cold so keen that the poet's teeth chatter. From a notebook departs from the cold, the hush of a winter's morning. At the outset of the fever, the speaker is again ill with a virus in bed, his teeth chattering. Mornings in a New House, which gave James the title for the fire screen, starts with it didn't start that way. It starts much better. It starts with a fire being lit by a cold man who hardly cares. The syndrome keeps coming back. After the fire departs from a trio of aging, disillusioned figures convening in a chill dusk. The will opens with the speaker making out a last will and setting out on his cold way. And so on. They all follow, these poems and many others, follow the path in the kimono, the initial poem in Divine Comedies, which begins with a disappointed lover who is frozen half dead by the wintry cold and a broken relationship, who returns to his hearth, dons a kimono, and magically somehow merges with what the pattern on the kimono evokes, which is to say the thawed stream in the preceding April's pastoral scene. In its reference to a bubble gleam here at the hearth side, at the end of the poem hints at a toast to beginning anew, which again, I don't mean to say all his poems end comically in the broad sense of the word, but many of them do. And he believed in comedy, I think, in a way that he did not believe in tragedy. Well, anyway, the bubbly emerges at the end of that poem I mentioned a while ago called Pledge, which recounts the breakup of a marriage that the poet attended years earlier. Now he lifts the glass to life, unsweetened, fizzing up again, he says here, even at the marriage's dissolution. So he's making his pledge. Pledge first made has been broken. It's over. Lifting the glass again to whatever it is to come now. This lifting this glass to fill the heart. I drink to you apart, he says in that champagne. And it's the pretty outrageous double entendre in that last word that epitomizes, I think, his sense of arriving at the work, through the work, the sense of a hope, of an order for a moment. The marriage, broken, the new lives waiting, the pain, the champagne, and the champagne. Thank you very much, everybody. Hold up on the cross.